Now let's talk Afghanistan. What is the true purpose of the US military's presence in Afghanistan? Is it simply to create institutions of democracy or to help build and protect a gas pipeline from energy-rich Central Asia right to the Arabian Sea? Well, as the US withdraws its first set of troops from Afghanistan as part of President Barack Obama's planned withdrawal, many are asking, is Washington actually plotting to stay on in Afghanistan and perhaps for the long haul? Well, that was the question asked by journalist Pepe Escobar in his article for Al Jazeera's website. It's called Why the US Won't Leave Afghanistan. It's a controversial piece. It's a very divisive piece, and I suppose that's why we're talking about it. It became the top trending story on the website Reddit. And Reddit, of course, aggregates news stories and lets readers comment on them. This is what the byline said. Surge, bribe and run, or surge, bribe and stay. How US military bases and the energy war play out in Afghanistan. As you can see, it was tweeted by 356, liked by more than 3,000. Let me show you what the article deals with. It's about a proposed pipeline. This is it. Let me try and blow it up. Of course, no pun intended. Let me try and make that a little bit bigger for you. There you go. It goes from Turkmenistan to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And it's called TAPI because it's an abbreviation of all those countries involved. It would be interesting if it actually happens because it would take a little bit of cooperation between Pakistan and India. So that's what the proposed pipeline is. And these are what some of the comments that have been coming through. Here's one. It says, this person obviously agrees somewhat with Pepe Escobar. It's about money. It's easier to make in an impoverished society. There are no winners unless there are losers. Let's go out of that from our Storyfy to somewhere towards the bottom. And here you go. Here's somebody who's not too keen on the theory, perhaps seeing it as a conspiracy theory. I'm all ears when it comes to intelligent arguments that we shouldn't be in Afghanistan, etc. But the notion that our entire involvement is some sort of get-rich scheme is absurd. Let's try to find out if it's absurd or not. Joining us now via Skype is Pepe Escobar himself, who says energy and not democracy is the true agenda of the US military strategy in Afghanistan. And also with us, as you can see on the screen, is Derrick Crowe, political director at Brave New Foundation. It's an American forum that encourages open debate about critical issues concerning the US. Currently, Derrick is working on a campaign titled Rethink Afghanistan. Welcome to the stream, both of you. Mr. Escobar, if I could start with you. As you heard from that quote that I just read out to you, somebody thinks it's absurd. Perhaps a lot of people would think the theory is absurd when they see it through the lens of the current geopolitical reality. How would you respond to that claim?
No, it's not a question of being absurd. It's a question of what's really happening on the ground. And this story has been buried by American mainstream media and most of Western mainstream media for not only 10 years, over 15 years. This story started in the mid-1990s during the Clinton administration. I've been following this story since the late 90s. When I asked the Taliban themselves how much money did they want for a pipeline to be built. And you know what they told me? What we need, which at the time used to be something around $50 million in terms of transit rights. At the time, during the Clinton administration, it was more or less settled that the pipeline would be built by UNOCAL. In fact, the Taliban were discussing with Bridas, an Argentinian company. Then UNOCAL stepped in. It's a very messy story, but basically, UNOCAL was supposed to land this contract. But then came 9/11. And until a few weeks before 9/11, I was in Pakistan, Afghanistan at the time, there were still discussions between now the Bush administration, not the Clinton administration anymore, and the Taliban about building the pipeline. And then after 9/11, there was that famous remark where Richard Armitage, when he told the Pakistanis and also the Taliban indirectly that instead of a carpet of gold, meaning, okay, let's build a pipeline, they'll be buried under a carpet of bombs if they didn't ally with America or if they didn't hand over Osama bin Laden. So this is an extremely complex, messy story on the ground that involves...
It's a complex, messy story, Mr. Escobar. However, you have highlighted one part of it, which perhaps Derrick Crowe would say is exaggerated. I want to bring him in. Let's try and get as much response as possible. Derrick Crowe, essentially, from what I understand, from what Pepe Escobar had to say there, was that instead of bribing the Taliban to the tune of, say, $5 million, the United States went and spent $5 trillion in the war on terror. It was a bad mistake.
It's absolutely true that it was a bad mistake. I mean, if you look at what that commenter said, that they can't believe this is a get-rich-quick scheme, I mean, one almost in a perverse sense would hope that it was a get-rich-quick scheme, because at least then there'd be some sort of rationality behind it. But as it stands, we've got an enormously counterproductive policy that's being pursued for any number of reasons, but none of them are looking at actual results.
Derrick, you see it as a counterproductive policy. However, do you agree that the pipeline features heavily in U.S. plans, maybe perhaps not so much in taking the U.S. into Afghanistan, but rather prolonging the stay in Afghanistan? Do you believe that the pipeline plays a role there?
Well, I'm sure it does in some factions of the U.S. government. I mean, there are a lot of different people pushing this bad policy for a lot of different reasons. But one of the things I told your producers was that if the United States is looking through a long-term military policy like the one that's in place now to lay the groundwork for a pipeline, and you need stability in Afghanistan in order to do that, that's a completely irrational thing for the United States to be doing, because the results on the ground have shown that the policy is absolutely not leading to stability. It's actually leading to much more instability.
Pepe Escobar, why do you think your article went viral, as they say?
It's very interesting because I've been writing about this on Asia Times extensively and in depth for years, always. I always have very good response. I'm very pleased that now writing, in fact, this is an extremely diluted version of an extremely complex story. I'm very pleased that I'm getting all sorts of comments from the conspiracy theory bracket to people who actually believe in it, because it's based on facts on the ground. I'm not peddling any agenda here. I'm an independent analyst and observer. I happen to have been to Afghanistan and Pakistan many times, very good sources, and this story has been going on in my head for over 10 years.
Well, if I could jump in here just for a second, I guess this is a question for both of you, and it's based on a tweet we have from Iron Chariots, who says, if it's a get-rich-quick scheme, it sure isn't working too well. So I guess this kind of begs the question, wouldn't it have been cheaper for the U.S. to just have gone ahead and done the pipeline beforehand and not be in as much debt as it is now?
Well, I mean, one thing to think about that would be that $5 trillion that we were just mentioning, that went somewhere. That went into people's pockets somewhere. Money just doesn't disappear. Somebody's making it on a scheme like that, right? So there are people in the United States making an enormous amount of money off this war, namely defense contractors, people who contract with the U.S. military and provide services to them there. So any war is that way, in which people do make a lot of money. It's just that money doesn't go into the American people's pockets generally. It goes into the hands of a very few.
Okay, let's get Pepe Escobar to answer that question, and then Julia will come in.
Look, Derrick is absolutely right. Can you imagine if this was being applied to overhauling the infrastructure of the West, which is crumbling absolutely everywhere, and it has been, directed towards health and education? The thing is, this is a concourse of circumstances and profits to be made by defense contractors, industrial military complex, parts of big oil, in this case American, but also Europeans. And the fact, very important, that is always overlooked, the thing is to bypass Iran and Russia as sources of energy. So this pipeline should come from Turkmenistan, cross Afghanistan, but benefit basically Pakistan.
But Mr. Escobar, you spoke about the fact that many conspiracy theorists are latching on to your article, perhaps supporting you, perhaps disseminating this, and maybe cherry-picking the parts that apply to them. when you say that this is about keeping, Iran in check and diminishing Russian influence, that may be a byproduct of being in Afghanistan, which the US is no doubt happy about, but that doesn't necessarily give them reason to go into Afghanistan, does it? That may not necessarily have been the reason for them to go into Afghanistan. Do you perhaps concede that?
No, it's not a question of conceding. Look, go to the facts. If you analyze the Pentagon's full spectrum dominance doctrine, which have been polished for the past few years. In fact, it was more or less ordinated in 2002. It was repolished in 2004. This is the Pentagon's Bible. It implies in that theater of war that now is called AFPAC, but in fact is Eurasia, Eastern Eurasia, that the number one priority is to prevent the emergence of competitors. The key competitors are Russia and China. And in terms of energy, the key competitors are Russia and Iran. So, as a counterpunch to the full spectrum dominance doctrine, what is happening in that theater at the moment? Russia and China are getting closer. China and Pakistan are getting closer. China wants a solution for Afghanistan that does not involve an eternal NATO war, which is depleting the US coffers and NATO's coffers as well. So, of course, in terms of unintended consequences, what Zbigniew Brzezinski wanted at the time in the 1990s, let's go back to Afghanistan, let's install ourselves over there, and let's have a second war, and now we're going to have it profitable in terms of benefiting economically from it. That's where the pipeline comes in. But the unintended consequence was, later there was the 9/11 development, later the US full spectrum dominance doctrine, now we're going to stay here for good. Now we have our military bases near Russia and China, we cannot abandon them. So you see, the whole thing one thing overlaps into another.
Indeed, it does overlap. And talking about overlapping, I want to bring Julia in here. Julia?
Well, I'm hearing all of this. I think there are two big questions. One is, why did we go in? And the other one is, why are we still there 10 years later? And I do think it's important to separate a bit the two. I was just at a conference about a week ago, and Rory Stewart, who many people call British consciousness, who was a foreign service officer with the British, and who is now a British Member of Parliament, was speaking, and he was very much saying that the reason why we're still there 10 years later is that the military has been unable to accept the notion of failure, and that the notion that you cannot fail inevitably leads to failure.
Let me take that and throw that towards Derrick. Derrick, would you agree that in a decade, the entire NATO-ISAF alliance, spearheaded by the United States, has not been able to clearly articulate the actual reasons for staying in Afghanistan? Many people might understand the reason for going in, given the circumstances surrounding 9/11 and the aftermath, but the reasons for staying have been murky at best.
I think that's absolutely true, but I don't want to say that in saying that the opportunities seen by folks who want this pipeline put in are playing into that mix. But what I will say is that we've never had a clear idea from the side of the Americans as to what victory looks like in Afghanistan with this counterinsurgency strategy. We've never been clear with the Afghans what our expectations are of them for their side of the counterinsurgency strategy. And we've had a political class here in Washington that has been unwilling to be the person who stands up and says, 10 years on is enough, we've failed in these objectives, and it's not worth the continued investment, because they're afraid of being called soft on defense. And that's a box that both parties have been painting themselves into for years in the United States.
Malika, dip into the tweets for us and give us some feedback from the community.
Well, one of the things that I think a lot of people on Twitter are kind of asking about is, what does this mean for contractors? One tweet here from Jay Blalock says, much of our military services are provided by groups like XE, the group formerly known as Blackwater. Maybe folks want to pipe someday, but they're getting rich right now. What can you tell us about what this means for contractors, our military contractors?
Who's that for, Derrick?
Anyone that can answer it.
Well, I mean, what it means for contractors in Afghanistan right now is they're making money hand over fist. I mean, they're the only clear beneficiaries of a policy of staying in Afghanistan right now. are the people who are being paid to be there. And that's, by the way, they're making a lot more than the average U.S. soldier is making over there. You've got folks like Lockheed Martin and General Atomics and folks like that who make the drones that are flying over Afghanistan. But even down to just the food service there is contracted out. And we even pay people to protect our convoys of soldiers, as if soldiers aren't capable of protecting
the soldiers of the soldiers.
Yes, it's outrageous, the layers of redundancy that we build there to give somebody a profit. So I mean, you're right that a pipeline is going to make somebody a lot of money someday, and it would, you know, provide certain strategic benefits in the minds of the people who are pursuing them. But there are people right now making billions off of keeping our soldiers there.
Okay, I want to throw something to Pepe Escobar from his very own article, because I found it interesting. It was a creative piece of writing, but I'm not too sure if I understand it fully. I've got it on the screen. Let's see if we can have a look at it. From the standpoint of these elites, you write, Mr. Escobar, the ideal endgame scenario is global Robocop NATO. What on earth does that mean, Mr. Escobar?
Well, you should read my pieces on Asia Times. It's all there. It's been there for years, actually. That's the thing. When you cover NATO, as I did in Brussels in the 90s, when you cover Afghanistan, Pakistan, when you cover Washington, when you cover China, after a while, I had one possibility. I could go to Bali and start selling ice cream or do surfing on the beach. And the other possibility, okay, let's take this all seriously. Let's see what this melting pot is all about. Look, the most important thing in AFPAC is who's profiting. Who's profiting is the industrial military complex. As Derrick said as well, the contractors, some earn $200,000 a year, especially the soldiery bit. And certain people inside the Bush and then the Obama administration who still pursue what is a big Brzezinski idea. Let's try to isolate Russia. Let's try to isolate China. If we build a pipeline, we're going to have Turkmen gas going to Western markets and not profiting Russia or Iran. But at the same time, they forgot to take a look at how do you fight a war against the Pashtuns. Everybody in history who fought a war against the Pashtuns lost. And that's exactly what's happening. Now the United States in Afghanistan, they are fighting a war against the national Pashtun majority resistance movement. And in the tribal areas in Afghanistan, because simply they cannot go there, because no American can go in the tribal areas, even disguised as a Pashtun.
That's a fair point about the Pashtuns, and that's a dynamic that many people don't seem to bring into the equation. We're going to let you flesh out your argument, and Derrick as well, in the post-show. We'll have 10 minutes more chat, if you like, in the post-show. Just very finally, Julia, some thoughts to wrap up here in about 20, 30 seconds?
Well, I think we didn't talk at all about what actually the local people might be thinking, and I do believe that's one of the key elements missing in any foreign policies, that we don't have people who speak the languages to really communicate. If you see our foreign service, either the American foreign service or the British or the people serving on the ground, there isn't proper communication going on. And I think, you know, it leads to this kind of ongoing debate, who's profiting, who's what, and we kind of even forget what the people want.
That's a fantastic point. Julia, Malika, Pepe Escobar and Derrick, thank you all. Thanks for watching the stream. We'll see you tomorrow. You can continue this conversation online. Hello everybody, you're still in the stream and you're back in the stream's post-show exclusive content for our web community. I hate it when that happens on the TV show. You just about start scratching the surface and getting into the discussion, and then you've got to say bye-bye and the weather comes next and all the TV adverts. It's no different even here on Al Jazeera. Let's call up our guests back on Skype, Derrick Crowe and Pepe Escobar. Let's put them back in the firing line so that we can continue this discussion. Derrick, I saw you, smiling and sometimes nodding when Pepe Escobar was talking about the role of NATO and the United States' intentions of how to use NATO as this fighting tool to police the world. Why don't you give us your take on it?
Well, I think, Pepe is right that there's a very large push inside the Defense Department, places like that, to, once we go into these countries like Afghanistan or Iraq or other places, to leave a contingent that never leaves as a base for global power projection, to be able to rattle a saber or respond to situations that might not be copacetic to U.S. interests in a particular region. And Afghanistan and Iraq are certainly good examples of that. I mean, if you look at Iraq, the United States keeps kind of offering to keep troops there beyond the deadline that we agreed to with the Iraqis, just as a favor, certainly, right? Like, we offering to keep tens of thousands of troops there beyond the deadline and hoping somebody in that government takes us up on it. And the same thing's going to happen in Afghanistan. We're going to do our best, apparently, on the Pentagon side to keep offering troops to help with the security situation or offer advisors. But it's really an attempt to maintain an extensive network of bases all over the planet. There's more than 1,000 of them right now, actually, that will allow the United States to project power into places where it wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity.
Yep.
And that's unfortunate because it's enormously expensive for the American people to pay for that.
Yeah, of course, expensive, terribly expensive, maybe not just for the United States, but perhaps for the world in terms of the human cost and financial cost. Pepe Escobar, Julia made the point that perhaps while we're all philosophizing and maybe at times pontificating about Afghanistan, people tend to forget what the Afghans really want.
Absolutely.
Would you say that their voices are completely forgotten in this equation?
Completely. First of all, it's a language problem. In case of the Pashtuns, nobody speaks Pashto. Some of them speak Urdu. So this means they have an audience in Pakistan. Practically nobody speaks English. Do you remember when the Taliban had a very important foreign minister before 9/11? He had press conferences at the gardens of the Taliban embassy in Islamabad every day, in Pashto or in Urdu, and there were like 10,000 English-speaking journalists around, and nobody understood anything. You needed a Pakistani to translate that for you. So it is a communication problem. If you talk to them directly over there in their own terms, when they have you as a guest and they treat you wonderfully, they tell you, look, we've been fighting foreign invaders since or even before Alexander the Great. We just want to be left alone. What the Americans are doing here is what the Russians were doing to us during the jihad in the 1980s. We're going to repel them as we repel the Soviets. So an average Pashtun will tell you that, and this is imprinted in their code, and their sons, everybody's, it's part of their Pashtun Mali code, which means being kind to foreigners, unless the foreigner wants to go there and steal your land and kill your people. So every time a drone, yes, every time a drone kills a wedding party in the tribal areas, you may be certain that generations of this particular extended family in this particular village will be fighting the Americans or NATO till kingdom come.
Malika?
So, and it's counterproductive on top of it.
Piggybacking on Julia's question and your answer, Pepe, I guess I wonder, we haven't heard from Afghans themselves, but also what are the American people saying? We have this tweet from Walid Zafar who says, does the U.S. want access to more energy? Yes. At the cost of massive budget cuts at home and thousands of dead Americans? No. So what are Americans doing to let their representatives know that this is either what they want or don't want? And what can they do?
Well, I can speak to that a little bit. My project, the Rethink Afghanistan project at Brave New Foundation, is one way that people have been using to get in touch with their elected representatives. If you go to facebook.com/rethinkafghanistan, you'll see that there's almost 60,000 people signed up there who are working constantly to let our elected representatives know that we don't support this war or the Iraq war or the other wars going on in the United States' name, and that we want those dollars and those people brought home to take care of problems that we have here at home. And you're right that more than 60% of Americans believe we should bring troops home ASAP, and those polls have been steady for a year now. And the American people want our leaders focused on the problems back here in the United States. And more to the point, the point that you and Pepe were just talking about, When you ask the average Pashtun, there was polling done there recently that showed that more than 90% of people in the southern Afghan areas haven't even heard of 9/11. And that's an enormous problem when you've got tens of thousands of American troops there using this as a justification that the people never heard of. I mean, when we started the escalations, there were surveys done of the State Department personnel as to who could speak Pashto, and it was less than 24 people. And we're talking about sending tens of thousands of people into a country with fewer than 30 people being able to speak the language of the core areas, and that's astounding.
I also think one very important thing to think about in any kind of invasion is that oftentimes when you come in, supposedly one of your goals being to bring democracy and to help women, the women's liberation movement, you oftentimes actually create a problem for those groups on the ground because they become associated with a superpower coming in and imposing an ideology, which is much better off, as we have seen, with the Arab Spring so beautifully lately, when it actually is a grassroots effort calling for it. I think it's great to see how the word democracy, was able to be reclaimed by people across the Arab world after becoming a bad word through the years of the Bush administration. And although this is not my day-to-day job, I do know that there are local women's organizations that have been working in Afghanistan through the 90s that have lost a lot of ground locally since the U.S. invaded.
Julia, fair point, and I think it's a good opportunity to wrap this up there. Derrick Crowe and Pepe Escobar. I don't think there is a logical conclusion to this discussion, which is part of the beauty of it, and I suppose the divisive nature of it as war continues to rage in Afghanistan. But gentlemen, it's been a great pleasure having you on the program. I'm glad that the Skype connection was crisp and clear and perfect, so we could hear you both nicely, see you both nicely, and that we all could have had a nice, civilized discussion. It's a great pleasure having you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. Pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
There you have it, Pepe Escobar and Derrick Crowe. We've just got, Katie, how much time do we have? About 3 minutes left on the post show. I suppose it's, about 3 minutes. I guess it's a good opportunity, Malika, to tell viewers that it's Nelson Mandela's birthday.
It is.
93 years old, 93 and going strong.
Right. And I alluded to it based on a tweet that we had from the Kurdish Twitter handle, the Twitter Kurds, a man who takes away another man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred. So on his birthday today, 93rd birthday, there is a lot of discussion online. I think President Obama sent well wishes to Mandela today. And I think that kind of opens up an interesting question. Though Obama was not the president, of course, 30-something years ago. 46 years ago. U.S. policy was a lot different than it is today.
Yeah, this is something I dug up over the weekend. The fact that when Nelson Mandela was possibly going to be executed because the apartheid government during the Rivonia trial had put all these revolutionaries, freedom fighters if you like, on trial for treason. There was the possibility of them getting the death sentence. There was a UN Security Council emergency meeting called by one of the non-permanent members at the time, Morocco. And the day before the sentencing, the United States, France, Britain, and Brazil, interestingly, had decided to abstain because they were all in some way or another doing business with the apartheid government at that time. That it cooks up endless questions about geopolitics, about international hypocrisy, about who's a terrorist today and a freedom fighter tomorrow, and this rebranding that takes place, doesn't it, Julia?
I think it's so important for us to look at the world today, given what you just mentioned about Mandela himself, and look at the people who are being imprisoned today, being called traitors in their own countries. The ones that come to mind in my particular line of work are Israelis and Palestinians who are working together using nonviolent efforts. And just recently, the Israeli government made it illegal for Israelis to call for boycott of Israeli settlement goods. And I personally think that in a few decades from now, hopefully, we will be looking at these people as the Mandelas of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And with Twitter, Malika, the fact that in the history books, we'll be able to have a far more vivid view of the zeitgeist won't we? We wouldn't just be looking at newspapers in archives as I do on the weekends in my free time.
Exactly, but I think it's also kind of interesting that the average Twitter user right now probably doesn't even remember, a time when Nelson Mandela was considered a pariah.
Right. Yep, that was when he was half his current age. Now everybody's wishing him happy birthday, as he definitely deserves it. His health is not so good, so we hope Madiba holds out for a little bit longer, perhaps to hit a century. Julia, Malika, great pleasure having you on the program. Are you both with us tomorrow?
Yes,
We are.
looking forward.
Great. We'll save your spots on the orange couch. Nobody will take your seats. I'll be here as well. Derrick and Ahmed are away all week, so you'll have to live with us. This is the best we could do. We're sorry about that. We hope you join us tomorrow. Bye-bye.